Hi everybody, welcome to NCR on Facebook Live. This is our first attempt at Facebook Live and we're very excited to be able to talk with you through this platform. I'm Caitlin Hendel. I'm the publisher of National Catholic Reporter.
I'm Dennis Cody, editor of National Catholic Reporter, and it's great to be here with you.
We have two other people in the room with us in the background. One of them is Brittany Wilmus. Brittany is our engagement editor. Brittany, say hello to the folks.
Hi, good morning.
And then we have George Goss. George has been an intern with us the last few months, and he's been helping us with our podcast and with other video needs that we're having. So George, say hello.
Hello.
And if you have signed on, please say hello through Facebook. We want to hear from you. And if you think of questions, please ask them, and we'll get to those in a little while. We thought we'd start first, though, with a look at some of the news that we've been looking at and covering here at NCR recently. Dennis, the big news today, obviously, for Catholics and everybody in this country is the President's decision to pull out of the Paris Accord on climate change. What do you think this means for the U.S., and what does it mean for Catholics who really want the U.S. to be able to address climate issues in this country?
You know, it's one of those stories that when it actually happened, it wasn't a surprise because people had anticipated the pullout was coming. Certainly the run-up in the election was pointing that direction, and everything we've heard since the inauguration was pointing that way too. And so it wasn't a big surprise. But I have to say, I was surprised at the volume and the vehemence of the response to it, especially among our readership who are more environmentally inclined and would be supporting climate change legislation from way back. I think they see this as a real challenge, and people are rising to that challenge. And I'm glad we've got Brian Rowe as our environmental reporter, and he's on that. As you can see in today's reporting and reporting Brian's been doing before. So I feel the community's engaged in this, and we're right there with them.
And Brian actually attended the Paris meetings 2 years ago, is that right?
That's right. He was in Paris for the negotiations back in 2015.
Because, as you know, it's always been a big issue for NCR, back from the 70s even. And we've written an editorial or two, saying this is a life issue, climate issues and care for the common home, as the Pope puts it. And, in Laudato Si, toward the very end, the Pope, who's kind of a grassroots Pope, called for grassroots movements on this issue as well, acknowledging that it's not always going to come from our governments and from on top. And I think we're already starting to see, Catholics for Climate Change have started a campaign. I think we're already starting to see some groups just trying to rise up. And in fact, I thought this was interesting, but as you may have heard, the president said he's all about Pittsburgh and not about Paris, and the Pittsburgh mayor popped in through Twitter and said, no, we're about Paris here in Pittsburgh. And so I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that much work can be done on the state and local levels, as well as from the federal government.
Brian and I were chatting just before I came down here, and we noted that two of the governors are kind of taking a leadership role now because the federal government stepped back, but Jerry Brown in California and Cuomo in New York are kind of taking a lead on this, establishing kind of a governor's group for action on the climate. And we noted, those are both old line Catholics. They go back all the way. Governor Brown is a former Jesuit seminarian. Of course, Cuomo in New York is old line Catholics. And so even it's, in a sense, it's kind of like their Catholicism's kind of creeping into this discussion. And it really is a Catholic kind of conversation that we're having about the climate.
It really is. It really is. If you're just joining us on Facebook Live today, welcome. It's, as I've said before, it's our first attempt at Facebook Live, and we see it as a real opportunity to be able to speak one-on-one with our readership who are all over the world these days. And we're based in Kansas City, Missouri, and we don't always get to speak to people one-on-one or face-to-face, and so we see this as a great opportunity. So if you're on, please say hi. And then please think of questions that you want to ask or comments that you want to make, and we'll be getting to those pretty soon. Dennis, one other story we've had this week is the Pope. He made a pretty difficult decision to cancel his trip to South Sudan. You want to talk a little bit about why that was and why that was such a hard decision for him?
Yeah, we'd been following that for some time. There was rumors through Rome. Josh McElwee, our Vatican correspondent, was following him, there was anticipation of a trip to South Sudan, but early this week, the Vatican formally announced that that trip would not be happening. And as you can guess, the main concern is security issues. Pope Francis made an interesting statement about that. He said that they said that they could get him into the country, but they were not comfortable taking him outside of the international airport in Juba. And the Pope made the statement of, if I can come in but I can't leave the airport, what kind of statement does that say about the country? And so he kind of balked on moving forward with that, according to McAwee's reporting. But again, I think it's another sign of Francis. His big term is accompaniment, and he sees this, especially accompanying the most vulnerable people in our society, in our world. This would have been his, I think, 4th trip to Africa. He's been in Uganda and Kenya. He was in the Central African Republic, even when there was not a standing government. They were trying to hold elections. Security was a big issue, but he went in there. And again, it's his idea of accompaniment.
No, I think it'll be interesting to see if he tries to make that trip again sometime soon. But it's too bad. But it's also understandable. Before we get to some of your questions, I need to do a little plug for NCR. So many of you may know today we are launching our annual Webathon, which is our annual online fundraising campaign. This is the 8th year in a row that we've done this. It was started by our former publisher, Joe Fearherd. Many of you are probably familiar with him. And this year we're doing things just a little bit different. We're going to be focusing on people and not on dollar amounts. And so what we're asking for, what we're looking for, is at least 2,000 people to donate to our Webathon this year. Dennis, we've already had a pretty good morning with the Webathon, and the numbers are starting to come in, and it's looking pretty positive.
There's a little gauge on the front of the homepage there that shows you how many people have donated so far, so be watching that little thermometer.
Yeah.
We only come to you once a year to ask for support like this, but now is that time.
This is true. And we ask people when they're donating on our new donation form, which we're very proud of online. We ask if there's anything particular they want to comment on, and we've received quite a few comments today, Dennis, from people about the Knights of Columbus story that Tom Roberts wrote last week and that we editorialized on this week. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I think again that's kind of a couple of things there. One is that that's the kind of story that NCR has built its reputation on. We got a little bit of criticism, wanting to know why we're picking on the Knights, and we tried not to pick on the Knights. In fact, we do, I think, a pretty good job of praising them, especially the local council level, where they really are the backbone of parishes. And when you need volunteers for something, when you need financial support for a parish project, a soup kitchen, a women's center, something like that, the Knights are always there, ready and willing to step up. But what we wanted to look at, and what we did, was to look at the highest level of the Knights, because they have a significant amount of money that they use to fund charitable organizations at that very high level. And that's what we looked at. That's what we tried to trace back. Because as everybody knows, influence follows money. And so we just think it's a good idea to be upfront about that and to show where that money is going. And you can draw your own conclusions about that. Maybe you're in favor of it. Maybe you have got questions about it of your own. But the numbers are out there, and we're asking people to look at them. And that was the point of the story. And
I think what Tom did was he looked at numbers that are open for everybody. They're on their IRS tax forms that any nonprofit has to file, including National Catholic Reporter. And Tom just took the time and effort to go through those numbers and look at them very closely and to sort of follow a money trail with the Knights of Columbus. And he also did a nice job of showing the history of Knights of Columbus. That it started as a fund for orphans and women, and it as an insurance fund, and it has grown from that into what it is today. And I think it never hurts to show those kind of numbers and to show the kind of influence that money still has in any institution, including the church. So I think Brittany is sending me a little notice here, so I think we are ready to start taking some questions. earlier this week we sent out an email alert or an email notice to a lot of our readers just saying that we were going to be doing this, and asked for questions in advance, and we did get a few, and so I wanted to at least talk about one or two of those first, and then if Brittany has others. Brittany, are we getting some questions? A few, not quite yet. Okay, we can do this. So if you have questions, please ask. Brittany's waiting. One of the questions we received concerned the number of Catholics in Congress right now during this particular Congress, and how they operate, how they vote, and what is their thinking process. Earlier this year, as they do every election year, the Pew Research Center, along with CQ Roll Call in Washington, D.C., put together the numbers on the people of faith, what faiths are represented in Congress. And in fact, Catholics as a group are the largest represented faith in Congress. With this particular Congress, 31% of Congress is Catholic. In 1961, the first year that information was compiled, it was 19%, so it's definitely grown. The Dems still have more Catholics than the Democrats, still have more Catholics than the Republicans. The Democrats have 37% of Democrats are Catholic, and 27% of Republicans are Catholic. And I think you can imagine that that both sides are voting differently. In other words, if you're a Republican Catholic, you're probably voting differently than your Democratic Catholic colleague. If you think back to the past, Dennis, we had Catholics like the Kennedys, of course, and we had Joe Biden, and now we have Paul Ryan is the Catholic leader of the House, and they approach not only the way that they represent their districts and their country differently, but they also approach the way they approach their faith is different as well. And so I think it shows that in the end you become a red Catholic or a blue Catholic when you're voting, but it's definitely worth taking a look at.
And we should note too that we're not. This is a demographic, okay, that would be shared in surveys or that the candidates would make public, and we're in no way judging them on their faith. We're not going to say we're going to have quibbles, especially with Paul Ryan's interpretation of Catholic social teaching, and we've addressed that editorially and in our reporting, and we'll continue to do that. We've questioned the Democrats also on pro-life issues and their platform in the last election on abortion. So we try to look at that as a demographic kind of thing, but also knowing that there is a common pool of beliefs and teachings that Catholics, self-professed Catholics, self-identified Catholics are, I would say, absorbed in. There's that common milieu, and that's what we try to explore. Again, we're not judging anybody. We're not calling somebody a bad Catholic or a good Catholic, but it's that one of those touchstones that brings us together in some ways and brings us apart in others.
No, I think that's right. One of the interesting aspects of this survey that Pew and CQ Roll Call did is that of the 535 members of Congress, 10 chose to not answer what their faith is, and they were all Democrats. And then one, it was a woman from, I believe, California. She identified as a nun, N-O-N-E-S, and so everybody else identifies as a member of faith. And I think that they at least think that that's important to this country. But I find that to be interesting, considering I think it's 23% identify as N-O-N-E-S, as nuns, as not affiliated. So I find this need to elect someone of faith in this country still to be an interesting demographic.
And in some ways kind of a uniquely American kind of idea of dividing up the political landscape.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, Dennis, one other question that we had was wondering whether there were any statistics on the number of restoration parishes. in the U.S. And I'll be honest, when I heard that term, I wasn't quite sure what it meant. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, a little background. First of all, this question arose because our field hospital correspondent, Peter Feuerherd, and Field Hospital is a special series we started about a year and a half ago, and it's based on a quote from Pope Francis that talks about that the church should be a field hospital ministering to people who are most vulnerable and most in need, and that's an ideal metaphor for a parish. And so Peter Feuerherd and Dan Morris Young are two veteran correspondents with us, and they took on the task of looking at parish life at the grassroots level in the United States under this series label of the Field Hospital. And so every week they do kind of a roundup of parish events and happenings that are going on that we think are of interest to readers. And then we try to do a major feature once a week too on that idea of how are people living out their faith at the parish level. And so that's taken us into all kinds of different kinds of areas and categories. Dan has done some profiles of parishes that take on a special ministry to the homeless in the northern climes of this country during the winter months. Peter's taken some in-depth look at different parish communities, one in North Carolina. He's working on another one in Florida right now. And so those are the kind of things they looked at. And in doing that, he ran across a parish and a group of priests in a diocese that identified themselves as being restorationists. And again, I think what that term means is, according to their definition, is that they see trying to return a parish to a kind of a more pure liturgical style, trying to increase the Catholic identity of a parish by a stricter interpretation of what happens or doesn't happen during the liturgy. That seems to be their focus. And that's a term that they have adopted among themselves, we were told. How widespread is that across the country? I don't know. There are no statistics on that kind of thing. Anecdotally, we do know that there's a generation of priests that have been ordained in the last, I'd say 15 to 20 years who would identify with that. The idea that if we can return to a time when the church was more rigid in their interpretation of what Catholicism is and practices and things like that, that would increase a parish's Catholic identity and could be used as a tool of evangelization. Anecdotally, we know that those kind of priests are out there and that those kind of movements are happening in parishes. And I shouldn't say just the priests. There are a lot of lay people that would be involved with those ideas too. So the actual numbers, I don't know. But again, keep reading the Field Hospital and we'll see what else we can find out about it. That's what I'd say.
Good. Yeah, it's an interesting trend, and it's interesting to see where it goes. Brittany says we have a question.
We do. We have people saying hello, also checking in from
Hi,
California,
everybody.
Baltimore, Australia. Someone's up late. A question from Pat McSweeney is asking NCR to address our bishops and their historic support of war in America.
Oh.
Caitlin, you want to handle that one? It's a very interesting question, especially at this time. And again, I want to discuss with you, but also let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing here, because it was a little more than a year ago, Pax Christi International, the peace advocate group in the Catholic Church, helped the Vatican organize a conference about just war theory. And what they did, they began a whole new discussion about just war and gospel nonviolence. And what we saw was kind of a renewed interest in those kind of ideas. I think Mr. McSweeney is correct that there's been the just war theory in the church has been very strong. The American bishops, I think it's safe to say that there's a strong tradition of patriotism and support of the military. The Bishops' Conference itself grew out of a movement in the First World War for the bishops to support the war effort. So that is definitely there. Yet what we're finding is people questioning that and wanting to move forward with beyond the just war and really embrace this idea of gospel nonviolence. And so I think we're trying to explore that with a series of articles that we call Making Peace. You can find that on the website, and trying to shake it up. I mean, we have, again, NCR has a long history of non-militarism in favor of peacemaking, but we're trying to do a comprehensive series of people talking about those issues.
And the Pope, in fact, had his peace conference about a year ago. Is that right?
Yes, that was the one where they talked about just war and
Right.
the gospel nonviolence.
Yeah. So, yeah. Good
There-
question.
Rumors persist that the Pope would like to write an encyclical, or at least an
Peace.
apostolic exhortation on peace. There's certainly strong strains trying to influence him in that direction, but we'll see where that goes.
Yeah. Okay, terrific. Well, Dennis, tell us a little bit, if I can put you on the spot one more time, about what we can look forward to in next week's NCR online.
Yeah, we've got some really good things, fun things, interesting things coming up. Again, we're going to be on the coverage of the environment and climate change, and kind of the people's movements of where do we go from here if you want to influence government action on climate change. So be looking for stories about that. Dan Morris Young, again, that's our field hospital correspondent that we mentioned. On Monday, we have a story coming up from him that takes an in-depth look at changes in canon law in regard to marriage annulments. And there was a change in canon law about 2 years ago. We're starting to see the effects of that now, and Dan takes an in-depth look at what those changes are and how they're influencing what's happening. A little hint, there's been a surge of people applying for annulments, and Dan explores that in depth. Heidi Schlumpf is our columnist correspondent based in Chicago, and our resident theologian beat reporter. She's going to be with the Catholic Theological Society of America in Albuquerque at the end of next week. She'll be doing some live blogging from there and a comprehensive report. And that's next week, Caitlin.
Terrific. I look forward to reading that, Dennis. So this wraps up our first Facebook Live event, and we enjoyed doing it, so I imagine you'll be seeing us again sometime in the near future. If you have thoughts on this way to talk with you, please put it on Facebook or email us privately, and we'd be glad to hear from you and to talk with you further about it. And please, if you can, if you will, go to our homepage, ncronline.org, and press the donate button and help us reach our 2,000 person goal for the webathon. I can't emphasize enough that while we certainly have other ways of revenue, other forms of revenue at NCR, we definitely need help from people in fundraising and with your donations. And we just could not provide for you what we do day in and day out if it weren't for the help and support that we get from our readers. So thank you very much for taking a chance and listening to us today, and we look forward to further conversations in the future.
Goodbye, and thanks for joining us.